Today's guest is a neuroscientist, psychologist, and author of the top-selling series Feed Your Brain. For more than 25 years, she has educated, coached, and impacted thousands of people globally. And today she's going to share with you new insights, ideas, and information to become more resilient. Would you please help me welcome our good friend, Dr. Delia McCabe. Thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Now, when I was having a look through your biography, I love to study. Our community members love to study. And I'm trying to figure out how you have a PhD across 3 disciplines. So what does that mean? And secondly, what does it actually involve to be able to get that PhD across 3 disciplines?
Well, I had to be tenacious, in all honesty, to start out, because I went to quite a few universities to try and study what I wanted to study, which is how nutrition impacts brain function and mood. And every university that I went to wanted me to focus on only one of those 3 things, either the psychology of stress or the neuroscience of stress or the nutrition of stress. And I said, look, they all fit together. You can't separate these 3 concepts. You have to examine them as a whole. And eventually I arrived at Adelaide Medical School. And Adelaide Medical School and their schools that fit under that umbrella are really interested in what we call translational research. That's research that we can do and then translate that research for normal people to use. So it doesn't just stay in academia. It becomes information that people who don't know anything about it can actually apply in their lives. And so that is how I managed to get to tackle all 3 of those disciplines within my topic, which was looking at the neurobiology of stress, specifically among women.
And to be able to take that course of study, how long does that take? And what's it involve? I've heard people say before that to get a practical PhD, it's the dissertation of about 25 to 30 books. It's just for a practical PhD outside of the universities. So how much time in research, years, papers does that involve?
Well, Daniel, it actually started long before I really tried to do a PhD, because I started with psychology. So I got a psychology master's degree. But while I was busy doing that degree, I discovered that nutrition really impacts the brain. So for the rest of the time before I started my PhD, which is over 20 years, I spent just independently researching that subject based on the psychology that I had already pursued. So by the time I got to the university, I had many, many thousands of hours and many, many books and thousands of journal articles behind me already. Then when I started my PhD, I then did primary research. Now, primary research is not taking other people's information and repackaging it to write a paper. Primary research is where you go out into the public and you actually find people, you find subjects to work with and to do the research with. So I had to do that research with human beings, living human beings, which is really complex. And primary research is very taxing from a personal perspective and from the perspective of writing up the papers afterwards. So I did a quantitative research project, which resulted in a quantitative paper that was peer-reviewed and is published and online. And then I did a qualitative research project, which is actually a lot more complicated, because what you're doing, you're taking narrative and you're converting it into concepts that you can share across the spectrum. You're looking at lived experience. So that was a really challenging research project as well. And it all started with a very large systematic review, because there was a huge knowledge gap. We don't know, or we didn't know until I did this research, how nutrition actually impacts women and whether dietary supplements actually ameliorate the stress. So the systematic review basically started the journey, Daniel, and then it led me to the primary research. So it was a long process, and it took me 5 years to complete the PhD.
Wow. Amazing discipline. And congratulations, because I know that for a lot of people in our community, we talk about driving forces, and we say in terms of acquisition of knowledge, there's 2 sides of the scale. On one side of the scale, we have the intellects, and these people just love to study. They don't necessarily want to have an output of the study, they just like to be in the study process. And then on the other end of the scale, we've got the instinctive learners. And they learn very differently. Our instinctive learners, they love YouTube learning. They love learning on podcasts. And they say, I just need one practical idea today. And if I can study it and get the idea, I can turn off the podcast or I can close the book. And what I want to let my audience know and remind them of is that however you study and acquire knowledge is okay. So if you want to get into the details, like Dr. Delia, do it. But if you are more of the instinctive learner and you just need that one idea to take the next step forward, that's also okay. So as I listen to this, I'm hearing about the importance of nutrition and the brain. And in preparation of today, I thought, well, maybe I should sit down and do a little bit of research on the brain. So I found 3 statistics, and these came from Northwestern Medicine. They said that the brain storage capacity is virtually unlimited. So for the people who have got limiting beliefs, I can't learn, I'm not smart enough, well, this is going to debunk that. Secondly, brain information travels at an impressive 431 kilometres per hour, and that our brain isn't fully formed until about age 25. So we've got this supercomputer. We have this piece of machinery that can produce the results that we want in our life. But how do we nourish this amazing system? How do we nourish it? Because we see athletes eating correctly. We see these $1 million horses and these studs feeding their horses correctly. How do we nourish this system so we can optimize it?
And I love this question because it's actually really simple, but it's also complicated. So we'll break it down really simply for people who just want some action that they can immediately start following. The bottom line is that the brain needs food that is nutrient dense. It needs to be colorful. It needs to be filled with good fiber. It needs to be clean. The carbohydrates need to be unprocessed. So that means they mustn't be refined. And the protein needs to be clean as well. So if we take that framework, we can see that the food that we eat should be as close to nature as possible. And only then on top of that, do we look at evidence-based dietary supplements. Because the brain is the greediest organ that we own. And as you showed with those statistics, the brain is capable of enormously complex, very sophisticated activities and can power us throughout a lifetime and enable us to make the best choices and to thrive. But the greed of this organ that allows us to do all these wonderful things needs to be taken into account. And most people do not understand that it is the most metabolically active organ that we own because it never sleeps. It's always doing something. Even when we're in a deep sleep dream, it's actually cleaning itself. So we need to take into account that every meal and every snack that we consume and everything that we drink needs to be based on, our choices need to be based on, is it going to be serving this magnificent piece of flesh or not? The challenge that we have living in today's really, really complex world is that we have stress added into the mix. And stress is also very expensive from a nutritional perspective. So when people feel overwhelmed, when they feel anxious, when they feel like they can't cope, when the world feels like it's overwhelming, all of those feelings result in the body producing adrenaline and then cortisol. And adrenaline and cortisol need nutrients to be synthesized. And when they are producing so much adrenaline and cortisol, there's sometimes not enough nutrients left to produce neurotransmitters, for example, like serotonin, which regulate our appetite and help us calm down and help us sleep. Even neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, which help us focus and concentrate. Because remember that the brain's primary focus is to keep us alive. And if we have to get away from that tiger that we sense is chasing us, which is a psychological threat in today's world, what it means is that the body and brain will be focused on adrenaline and cortisol synthesis and not on all the other neurotransmitters that we need to thrive. So nutrition is really the foundation of being able to live our best life.
I'm looking at my coffee there, and then I'm thinking to myself that it's black, and my wife tells me, Daniel, stop wearing black, and then she tells me black's not a colour. And now I hear that my nutrition has to be colourful, and I want to take a sip of it, and I'm trying to convince myself that I did put a whole lemon in that coffee this morning.
Daniel, a lot of people think coffee is off limits, and coffee isn't off limits. I always ask people, when I do an in-person presentation, which isn't that often anymore because of COVID, I have a slide which shows how coffee works from a biochemical perspective. And it's not complicated.
I'm going to take a sip as you talk.
I really make it simple. So, people can understand how coffee works. And I always say to the audience, do you want to know how it works or don't you? And 50% say yes, and the other 50% aren't sure. The bottom line is that coffee actually releases adrenaline and dopamine into the bloodstream and into the brain. And so what happens is we get that little jolt of pleasure and that little jolt of energy. The challenge comes if we're not eating really well, and if we're not moving, and if we're not thinking in the right way. We actually deplete our energy supplies when we drink coffee, because we're relying on coffee to give us a false sense of energy, if I can put it that way. And that leads to us treating coffee like a crutch. So as long as people are not doing that, as long as they're making sure they've got energy from lots of other sources, and they don't drink coffee after about 2 to 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, they won't interfere with their sleep, and they will be building other avenues of energy production.
When I woke up this morning, my face was puffy because I'm addicted to this Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. And unfortunately, the time it plays is when I want to get into bed. And my wife said, husband, this is time with me. And so I just, instead of having both earbuds in, I put one earbud in. She said, I can see the earbud in your ear. I said, I know, I'm just addicted to this trial. I find it's fascinating. So I stayed up late, which I rarely do. So I was staying up late, but I'm feeling guilty because I'm going against my own moral code. My moral code is go to bed early, get up early, and start your day. But I'm fatigued today. And so I went to the kitchen and I thought, how can I get this puffiness out of my face? I saw that maybe a coffee's a good idea. It'll wake me up a little bit. So the other thing that I'm hearing is we are what we eat. And I think it's so important about what we put in our body. And as an expatriate, we spoke briefly before about being an expatriate. I moved to the Middle East and I was living in Dubai, and all of a sudden the diet changed. So I went from the Australian diet, where I would tend to eat a lot of salad. I love salad, and you can get wonderful salad in Australia and you're not going to get an upset stomach. But then I moved to Dubai and the salad was available. However, it's been shipped over from Spain, South Africa, and it's been in the refrigerator for maybe 6 months. So you eat this lettuce, you eat these carrots, and there's no taste to it. And so my diet quickly changed, and there was a lot of Indian food, and even though it was vegetarian, it was very thick in sauce. So I noticed that my body changed very quickly, but the energy levels changed. And then I had to, almost out of necessity, to start to drink coffee, because it was like, I've got to try to stimulate myself. And then eventually, after years, I moved to Taiwan. But then I got a Taiwanese belly, where now I'm consuming a lot of rice, no salad, but a lot of vegetables. So the body took, I think, years, in my mind, to catch up to that new eating lifestyle.
Well, Daniel, that's part of the challenge that we experience as human beings. We now know much more about nutrition than we've ever known before. We didn't understand how we need certain nutrients, and how certain nutrients were toxic, or not nutrients, how certain toxins were damaging to the body. But I just want to go back for 1 minute, because we aren't really what we eat. We are what we absorb. So if our gut is compromised, then we cannot really absorb the nutrients that we need. So a compromised gut is a challenge and needs to be addressed really quickly to be able to make optimal use of all those wonderful nutrients. But the problem is, you spoke about your diet changing. One of the things that happens to people when their mood changes, or when they become really anxious and depressed or overwhelmed and very stressed, their food choices change, and then that changes the gut microbiome and, of course, brain function. Because when we are very stressed, we naturally gravitate to foods that are easy to eat, and also foods that release a hit of dopamine, which is a hit of pleasure, and actually, interestingly, allow the body to also release what we call endogenous opioids. These are opioids that the body makes and allows us to feel calm and relaxed for a little while. So we build habitual habits around certain foods from an emotional perspective, which actually have a neurobiological effect on us. So it's important to keep in mind, when we tackle these challenges with food and with mood And with brain function, we need to tackle it both from a psychological perspective and also from a physiological perspective, so that we're tackling it from both angles to be able to get the best result. Because those nutrients that your body needs, the nutrients that you were getting from salads, those demands and needs don't go away just because your diet has changed. You need to find a way to still find those foods. And I'm assuming that in Taiwan it's a little bit easier, because maybe what you could do is find a farmer's market, for example, and go and buy that fresh produce and add more of that fresh produce to your rice, so that you're not only getting that carbohydrate, you're also getting the color and nutrient density that you need. So it's an interesting, complex conversation, but the brain doesn't care about our circumstances. The brain just knows what it needs. And for us to be able to focus on that, I think is kind of luxury in a sense, but we do have to make an effort if we find our circumstances constrained. I even say to people, grow some lettuces on your balcony if you live in an apartment, even grow some herbs. Find your local farmer's market, make a huge effort, because the benefit that you give your brain lasts across your lifespan. And we know already that food really does impact the brain and how it ages. So it's definitely worth something paying a lot of attention to.
For our community members, you've heard me talk about this before. You can work on your mind. You can change the conscious content of your mind. You can release your emotions out of the unconscious mind. But you also got to take care of your physical body. And for a lot of people, they haven't learned how to do that. And so what I'm learning today is that and it reinforces what we know, is that there's a connection between what we're putting in and our performance. A lot of our clients, they do self-sabotage, but they don't even realize how they're sabotaging their own success. And through the studies at Harvard University, they realize that when we are overwhelmed, we tend to sabotage more often. And a couple of things that we tend to notice is we don't utilize our unconscious mind enough. The unconscious mind's got a bad rap over the years because people haven't really understood it. It's hardwired. There's a set of principles, and we've got to understand those to make it work. When we're overwhelmed, we find it very hard to interpret feelings of overwhelm, and we see overwhelm as a weakness. And the third thing we tend to do is we tend to withdraw from people offering support. So these are some of the things that Harvard Business Review are pointing out to us. So, Dr. Delia, what can we learn about this from you? What can we learn so we can decrease our overwhelm and then improve our mood?
One of the things to keep in mind, Daniel, is that, and one of the things I do when I work with people, I really get them to fine-tune on what their values are. Because once you know exactly what your values are, you shift your priorities. And when your priorities shift, you know what to ignore and what to focus on. And just the example that you gave, about the Johnny Depp and the Amber Heard binge that you're on at the moment, you know that you're not going to be doing that forever. You know that you're not going to compromise your well-being on an ongoing basis. For you, it's just a little hiccup that you're going through right now, if I can call it that. So when we know what our values are, we value health, we value being well rested, we value long-term holistic well-being. When we know these are the things that we value, our priorities need to shift, and we know what we can then start ignoring. And one of the things that we need to ignore in this very, very complex world that we've all created together, we need to learn to know what we can control and what we can't. A lot of the overwhelm that people experience today is because they're involved in social media, they watch the news all the time, they think about all the things in the world that are looking horrendous and that they can't control, and then they spend time and energy, neural energy, which is in short supply, on the things that they can't control. So I also teach people to focus only on what they can control, because then we reduce that neural overwhelm load. And the third thing is also that the brain loves to make habits. And that's one of the ways we can allow the subconscious to actually help us. Because once we establish a habit, it basically goes into our subconscious and it just sits there, and then it can either serve us or not. And I know that the way you work with your community, you get them to allow their subconscious, their unconscious to actually support them. And creating healthy habits is a wonderful way to do that. So I always say to people, make sure that your pantry only has food in it that you know is going to support you. So then when you go to make a meal really quickly, you just grab what's out of your pantry, what's out of your fridge, and you can toss a meal together really quickly. And I teach people how to do that, because when it takes a really long time to make a meal, what is our default option? let's grab something on the go. Let's do it really quickly. Let's not worry about the nutrient density. So when we make our surroundings that really support us, and we do that from a habitual perspective, it's no longer hard work. It doesn't take a lot of neural energy to do that. So once we focus on our values and our priorities, once we focus on what we can and can't control, and we focus on creating really good habits, that framework really supports us to allow us to really thrive and live our best life.
It's interesting about the habits with eating. One of the things that I say is, I don't snack. Now, that's not the appropriate language for the unconscious mind. I don't snack, and I always say no to the snack. So somebody offers me a snack between meals, the answer is no. So I have my 3 meals a day, and that's a great habit for me because I don't feel I need the Snickers bar. I don't feel I need to have the Mars bar in between meals because I've trained myself over the years that I'm going to have my 3 key meals per day. If I'm going to the gym, I've also created a habit, and here it's very easy because of access. You can go down to 7-Eleven or Family Mart or High Life, and you can get a boiled egg that's been boiled in tea. So I can have a healthy snack before I go to the gym. I can have an egg, or I can, what we call as digua, sweet potato, and it's already cooked. So you've got a couple of healthy options here. So I train myself that I do this, and then I just do that on repeat, and it becomes a good habit. But I think a lot of us get into bad habits, and we're confused about nutritional value. I remember going to school. They would serve you cup noodles all day, and you think it's of nutritional value. They'd sell you meat pies, sausage rolls, and all of a sudden you think it's of nutritional value, but it has nothing substantial in it at all.
Yeah. It's an excellent point that you make there, Daniel, because what happens is we do get into bad habits, and one of the ways to tweak those bad habits is just simply to substitute the thing that you're eating that you know doesn't really support you with something that does, but it also tastes yummy, because then we don't have a sense of deprivation. One of the reasons people eat from an emotional perspective is because they're trying to treat themselves, give themselves a treat if they've done something well, or otherwise give themselves a treat because they're feeling low from an emotional perspective. So that, unfortunately, one of the reasons we get confused between emotional eating and survival eating, which we do all the time to keep ourselves alive, is because eating also gives us feelings of pleasure. So when we have emotions related to pleasure and a survival instinct, which is to eat when we're hungry, those two can get confused when we feel overwhelmed and stressed and when we haven't got the right habits in place. So it's important to separate the two, but to also not leave ourselves feeling deprived. So I say to people, look, we need to replace that thing that you're treating yourself with something that's also yummy, but that's nutrient dense. When we do that, the sense of deprivation disappears, and you're getting that a nutrient density. You're actually consuming those nutrients. The other thing that you're doing, which most people don't realize, and I do this in kind of a sneaky way, we're aiming to keep our blood glucose stable. Because just think about this. There's nowhere in the brain to store fat or store energy, okay? We know where we store energy on our body. But there's no place in the brain to store energy, which is why people will get hangry. They'll get angry, they'll be hungry. It's because blood glucose dips really quickly, and the brain sends a message to the body, eat now, because I need fuel. And then what most people do, they reach for something that's really highly processed, that gives them a really quick jump in blood glucose, but then what happens is a quick dip again. So the aim of the exercise is to keep blood glucose really stable, because when blood glucose is stable, we think more clearly, we can focus and concentrate with greater efficiency, we don't get as moody, our moods stay more stable, we also keep our blood glucose balanced, which is the aim, which keeps our weight stable, because the more times blood glucose jumps up and down, the greater the chances are that any excess carbs we eat will be stored as fat. That's just a biochemical reaction happening below the surface. So keeping blood glucose stable and making sure the brain's got enough energy does a number of wonderful things in the body. It even helps us sleep better. So we need to make sure that those little treats that we're giving ourselves are nutrient dense, taste yummy, keep blood glucose stable, and when possible, get to the point where we don't need to snack. Because when we don't need to snack, we know that we've got stable blood glucose over many hours, which is the ultimate which is the ultimate aim.
So true. I'm thinking about one of my friends who rewards himself, not with food, but with a beer. So we went surfing, and we're in Sydney, and we went out, we surfed for about an hour, and he caught a really good wave. And sometimes when you surf, you get the wave of the day, and everything after that is a disappointment. And so when you get that wave of the day, you just catch it all the way into the beach. And I saw him catch the wave all the way into the beach. He stepped off his surfboard onto the sand, and he walked straight up to the car. So I knew at that stage he was finished surfing. So I waited and waited for my wave, but he got the wave of the day, so I paddled in. And by the time I got to the car, he was drinking a beer. And it was 10 o'clock in the morning. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm rewarding myself." I said, "What for?" He said, "Because I got the wave of the day." And I said, "You reward yourself with a beer?" And he goes, "All the time." And so he had trained himself that if he had a good wave, then he could justify having a beer at 10 a.m. in the morning. And I said to him, I said, we might have to have a look at some of these habits. But for him, these habits, we run them, we don't think about them, and we stop challenging them because it just becomes our normal operating procedure. Catch a good wave, have a beer, doesn't matter what time of day it is.
The challenge is also if you have a bad day and that's the way you reward yourself, then that's actually a form of self-medication because it lowers your central nervous system. So we need to be very careful about how we're treating ourselves and what those habits are, because Daniel, I know that you teach this as well. We need to stretch. We need to get ourselves out of our comfort zone if we're going to grow as human beings. And when we keep on going on automatic, habitual, hamster wheel habit responses, we're not getting out of our comfort zone. We're not pushing ourselves to live our best lives. So there are a number of reasons why we need to really do a bit of deep examination around these habits and why we actually are hankering towards those habits versus stepping out of our comfort zone and really, thriving.
I agree, 100%. Now, we could talk all day, and I love this topic. For those of our members who want to learn more, they want to learn about dietary supplements, they want to learn about stress and resiliency, they want to learn about these nutrient-dense meals and treats, where can they follow you and where can they learn more about the good work that you're doing?
Daniel, they can happily visit my LinkedIn profile, but what I normally suggest people do is that they have a look at my 7-point checklist. And I actually devised the 7-point checklist at the beginning of COVID because people said to me, "What are you doing to stop feeling overwhelmed?" And I said, "Look, I'm going back to first principles." So I put together a 7-point checklist, and I know that you'll have it in the show notes for people to be able to download. If they read through that document, it's not very long. They will see what I do every single day to ground myself, to center myself, to be able to allow my body to cope with whatever it's experiencing. And also I've got a checklist for the kinds of food that I need to be eating every day. And that's really useful for people who are wanting to get into a new habit and start a new framework of looking at their food. So that's what I suggest people have a look at. They can happily go to my website as well and have a look at my articles. They are long, they're in a lot of detail, and they're fully referenced as well. But I would suggest the 7-point checklist is a great start just to get yourself immersed in this way of thinking about nourishing ourselves, both from a psychological perspective and from a nutritional perspective.
I believe in these checklists. I know the importance of them. And for all of us, we have to make the invisible visible. And yes. I went through the process of writing down everything that I consumed, everything that went in my mouth in the morning to everything that went into my mouth in the afternoon. And I was actually shocked what I was putting in, and I was totally unaware of it. I started to have a look at the cans of Coke that I was eating. I was having a look at all the spicy foods, the oily foods I was eating, and I was shocked. And once I became conscious of what was unconscious, these eating habits, I then could make a better choice, because before that it was invisible to me. And I started to systematically say, I'm not going to eat this. That's coming out of my diet. And one of the results for me was my energy increased. That was the first thing that I noticed. Yes. And then secondly, my waistline started to shrink. And it happened automatically. And I was blown away. I was like, oh, wow, this is actually happening. And I just become more aware of it. And so if you haven't done this, and most people don't stop to think about their food because it's so habitual. Remember, it's a survival mechanism. You wake up, the brain here is for survival. It's not for success. It's not to thrive. It's just for survival. So out of necessity, you just reach out, open up and put it in. But we've got to reconsider what we're putting in. Well, thank you so much.
Sorry, Daniel, it doesn't take a long time to do that. You know, you start these new habits and you get all the positive benefits, like example, energy, weight loss, and you start thinking more clearly. That's one of the best things when this happens, because your brain's got what it needs to be able to focus and concentrate.
100%. I spoke to a gentleman yesterday, and we were talking about creating habits, and it can take a long time to change a habit, or as you mentioned before, to substitute a habit with, you can't just stop eating. You've got to eat, but you've got to substitute the food. You just can't stop eating. People do that, but it doesn't go well. And so it can take a long time, even lifetime, to change a habit. I'm 42 and there's habitual eating patterns in families. So it could take you your whole life to substitute that habit. But what I want to reinforce is the decision happens in a split second. You can make a decision immediately to quit smoking. You don't have to wait 6 weeks. You don't have to go through the drama. You make the decision now, and the decision happens immediately. And you can also make the decision to eat better today. And your mind is a very good servant. And if you say, eat in this direction, it'll trigger off your reticular activation system, and you'll see more of those good foods where you never saw them before. But the decision is just in a split second. That's it. So don't wait. Do something today. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you get the 7-point checklist. We will post that in the show notes below. Also visit LinkedIn at Dr. Delia McCabe on LinkedIn. And for the first time, Dr. Delia, I noticed that you had an audio description of what you do on LinkedIn. That was so cool. So I clicked on it, and there was your personal introduction on LinkedIn. So this technology is becoming phenomenal. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, live life on your terms. If you're working on your mindset, if you're working on your emotions, the next thing is you've also got to work on the physical body and give yourself the greatest chance of success by putting the right things into your body to start with. Dr. Delia, thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you, Daniel.
Ciao for now.